After a virus-enforced break, Airshow Dispatches returns with one of the first post-pandemic airshows of 2020. On the 4th of August, the Imperial War Museum at Duxford hosted the first of 3 showcase days of the year, small-scale airshows focusing largely on locally based aircraft, many of which don't feature at the museum's larger events. As well as exploring the extensive museum site, visitors enjoyed a fly-in of classic aircraft, pleasure flights, and approximately 90 minutes of aerial displays. The show celebrated 100 years of the de Havilland Aircraft Company, with a 3-ship formation of de Havilland types in the flying display. And it also paid tribute to the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. This is our pick of the action. Welcome to Duxford, home of the Imperial War Museum and one of the most famous airshow destinations in the world. In the roller coaster that was 2020, Duxford also played host to the first traditional, i.e. non-drive-in airshow of the UK season, with its showcase day on Tuesday the 4th of August. Joining me at the show and talking through this episode of Airshow Dispatches is Alex Prinz. And Alex, it was a real pleasure to be back on an airfield again for the first time in many months.
Yeah, it really has been a case of you don't know what you've got until it's gone. Now, this event wasn't a true air show, not as we might expect. It was more of a halfway house between a Duxford Airshow day and a standard day at the Imperial War Museum.
And as well as the formal air displays, there were plenty of other aircraft movements throughout the day, not least as part of an impromptu fly-in. And we've seen the likes of the civilian coupe, the de Havilland Dragonfly, the Booker Bestman, the Fuselage Door, and so on. So we're just enjoying a few of those movements before focusing on the main flying display.
I think for the few hours between 10 a.m. and midday, there was actually barely a moment where there wasn't a vintage aircraft of some description either taking off, landing, or taxiing past. The place was absolutely buzzing, and it was a real reminder as to why Duxford is the epicentre of historic aviation in the UK.
Yeah, and it's a place that I'm somewhat ashamed to admit I haven't been to for many years, not since 2012, I think. So it really took this pandemic to get me back to Duxford, I suppose. But I'm very glad I did, because it was an enjoyable day. Very strong de Havilland theme to the event, by the way. So you'll note here a DH-87B Hornet Moth. That was part of the fly-in. There's a locally based Tiger Moth taking off on a pleasure flight behind it. Classic Wings Dragon Rapide was up and about during the day as well, so I think it's fitting therefore that we start our look back at the official flying displays with a special 3-ship performance marking the de Havilland centenary, and that was featuring a Dragon Rapide, Beaver and Chipmunk.
This was a really nice display, and it had some of the best formation flying that I think we saw all day, between aircraft that must handle quite differently. But it was clearly well thought out, and it paid a great tribute to this icon of the golden age of flight.
It was in September 1920 that former Airco engineer Geoffrey de Havilland established his own aircraft design bureau. Initially, the company produced old Airco designs after that company folded, but in 1925 de Havilland's first original design, the DH-60 Moth, went on the market and saw immediate sales success as a dependable and economical touring and training aircraft. Over the decades that followed, de Havilland became a truly pioneering company. Their achievements include the Comet, which was the world's first jet airliner, the Vampire, which was the first jet to cross the Atlantic and the first to land on an aircraft carrier, the mighty Sea Vixen, the Trident, and many others. Now a spirited solo display from the Dragon Rapide in wartime Scottish Airways colours. The airline used Dragon Rapides for vital supply and transport flights around the Scottish Islands, for which they wore Royal Air Force style markings. They would have also had their windows painted over in white to stop the passengers from seeing out if the aircraft passed over sensitive areas such as naval bases.
A couple of passes now by the Chipmunk and Beaver. Now, if we're being pedantic, neither of these are actually true to Havilland designs. Though we like to think of them as British aircraft, and indeed many were produced here in the UK, these are in fact the first two original designs that were produced by de Havilland's Canadian subsidiary, de Havilland Canada.
Yeah, and unlike de Havilland here in the UK, that company is still active today as part of Bombardier Airspace, and several of its aircraft, such as the DHC-6 Twin Otter and the Dash 8 Q400 airliner, were still being produced by other Canadian manufacturers at the start of 2020, although production has since been suspended by the coronavirus pandemic. Now the first of today's heavy warbirds, the Norwegian Spitfire Foundation's P-51D Mustang Warhorse.
Characteristically powerful display here by Esker Landau, showing off the aircraft's new paint scheme to great effect. Though it was formerly more recognisable perhaps as the Shark of RAF 122 Squadron, this aircraft now wears the colours of the United States Army Air Force. Warhorse was the Mustang of Colonel Donald Blakesley when he served with the 4th Fighter Group at RAF Debenham in Essex, though he did fly with the RAF in the time before the United States entered the war as part of the iconic Eagle squadrons.
Yeah, and a great many achievements to his name, particularly while he was serving as the commanding officer of the 4th Fighter Group. And in that time he flew the first Mustang sortie over Berlin, that was while escorting B-17s and B-24s, and he also led the first Operation Frantic shuttle bombing mission over Russia. He scored a total of at least 17 kills and amassed in excess of 1,000 combat hours. And you can hear so clearly that famous whistle caused by the sound of the air moving over the gun ports, and combined with that Merlin engine, it really is an iconic sound. Now, something of a change of pace, and it's very difficult to decide which flag to put with this display, because we now have Peter Kuipers, who is Dutch, flying a French-registered, Belgium-based, Russian-designed Yak-50 named Sasha.
And straight into a half vertical eight-on takeoff. Half a loop, half a roll, and then another half loop on top of that one for good measure before a rolling descent.
That really does set the pace for what's to come, an immensely accomplished display from a pilot who's more used to displaying much larger aircraft such as the B-25, C-47 and Duxford-based B-17G Flying Fortress Sally B. Stall turn next as Kuipers pulls up into the vertical, waiting for the airspeed to bleed away, and then kicks in a bootful of right rudder to pivot around that right wingtip.
A very impressive launcher back next, as he pulls up into the vertical again and tumbles the aircraft through all of its axes. The word launcher back is Czech for headache or hangover, and as you watch this manoeuvre, I don't think it's hard to see why.
At the 1976 World Aerobatic Championships. Yeah, great.
This is a very comprehensive display of this popular 1970s training and aerobatic aircraft, and a lot of people are surprised just how new the Yak-50 is. This design came after the Laser 200, for instance, which was the inspiration for the Extra family of aircraft, which we'll look at in a moment. But despite its looks, it is a very capable performer and won both the men's and women's categories in the World Aerobatic Championships during its debut year in 1976. And now rounding out its display with a rolling circle, rolling the aircraft continuously as it flies a 360-degree left-hand turn. Now, I mentioned Walter Extra's family of aerobatic aircraft a moment ago, and here is the best-selling derivative of them all, the Extra 300L, starting its display with a stall turn.
James Heppner at the controls, performing only the second display of his airshow career.
By Walter Extra. And the type first flew 19...
Hepner is a full-time airline pilot, though he's been flying the Extra now for 5 years, and he made his display debut at the Shuttleworth Collection's August Drive-In Airshow just a few days before this display at Duxford.
You might have just seen a little correction there after that aileron roll. I think it's fair to say it's quite a cautious sequence, but most importantly, a safe one.
It certainly was a bit different from the Extra displays that we're used to seeing, because it consisted more of intermediate level aerobatics and a focus on the grace of the Extra rather than performance and manoeuvrability. But hopefully that is something that will develop with time and experience, and I'm sure James Hepner will soon be a fixture on the airshow circuit.
Yeah, and for a debut season on a high-performance aircraft like this, it is impressive. I know some new display pilots are strongly advised not to fly aerobatics at all in their first season. Yet here we have a display sequence which, had it been performed in a lesser aircraft like a Yak 50, we'd probably say was very engaging, irrespective of pilot experience.
This 300L model features several design changes from previous versions of the Extra.
Another stall turn, curiously being performed with the wind rather than into wind, which is not, I thought, the most common way to fly a stall turn. And now pointing the aircraft back at the camera for a 4-point hesitation roll. And you can see, if you look at the smoke trail, there's quite a lot of rudder work going on in the knife edge portions to keep the aircraft on the level, because of course its wings aren't producing any lift at that point, so without a bit of top rudder, the aircraft would simply start to drop out of the sky.
If you get a chance to have a closer look at the Extra on the display line, you'll notice that the
You get a glimpse at times at the Extra's immense roll rate of some 400 degrees per second. That's near as make no difference as faster roll rate as you'll find on any aircraft, and it's stressed to plus or minus 10G. All that makes the Extra 300 family the aircraft of choice, both for aerobatic teams such as the Blades and the Royal Jordanian Falcons, but also for competition aerobatics, and its uprated derivative, the Extra 330 SC, has won 5 of the last 6 unlimited titles at the World Aerobatic Championships, usually in the hands of French Air Force pilots from the Équipe de Voltige. With the next act, we go back in time once again with a pair of Radial engine trainers rolling from the grass. Europe's only flying North American NA-64 Yale leads T6 Harvard Mark IV Wacky Wabbit. This display gives us a good look at these two very closely related aircraft, which both trace their roots back to the North American NA-16 family. The T6 was actually the first of the two to fly in 1935, followed by the Yale 5 years later, although this particular T6 is much newer, being built in 1953. The main visual difference is that the Yale has fixed undercarriage, and you'll notice the design of the wings is also quite different. The T6 has relatively flat wings, while the Yale has much more dihedral. Just 230 Yales were built compared to over 15,000 T6 family aircraft, most of which served with Canada and France, and some of those later flew with the Luftwaffe after France's surrender to Germany in 1940. Every single Yale that survives today comes from the collection of a Canadian farmer, Ernie Simmons, who bought 39 Yales in 1946 and kept them on his farm until his death in 1970, whereupon most of them were put up to auction.
Quite a gutsy display from the Yale, with some lovely low-level turns and wingovers, as you can see, all performed to the wonderful soundtrack of that Wright R975 Radial engine. The T6 in comparison performed a simultaneous aerobatic routine, but at a much higher altitude, and we'll take a look at that in just a second.
Two aircraft have quite different wings, known to the wider center.
Yeah, a quick look at the T6 now, looking much cleaner with that retractable undercarriage. This was an enormously successful aircraft. It served with some 60 nations, and South Africa only retired its last T6s from active service in 1995, so a service life that has spanned well over half a century.
And with that, we move on to a pair of much smaller aircraft.
Yes, indeed. Specifically, the Levere Cosmic Wind and Cassett Racer now starting their display. The Cassett in the lead, an American Formula One racer that first flew in 1951. This is a 3M variant with a slightly decreased wingspan, just under 14 feet wide. And this aircraft actually flew as part of a short-lived three-ship Cassett display team here in the UK around a decade ago, called the Dukes of Cassett. Here's the Cosmic Wind starting its solo display with a vertical 8, like the one we saw from the Yak earlier really. It's a mightily impressive manoeuvre under any circumstances, but even more so when you consider that this aircraft has just 85 horsepower. And indeed all round, it is a very accomplished display indeed.
Absolutely, there were some very demanding manoeuvres indeed here, and they were all executed impeccably by its owner and pilot, Pete Kinsey.
Just watch these vertical rolls. Again, very impressive, but not as easy to pull off as they look. It may appear just to be a sequence of aileron rolls, but the Cosmic Wind has no inverted fuel system, so there actually has to be a slight barrel element, a little bit of back pressure on the stick throughout those rolls, just to keep the engine running. Now into an Immelmann, that's a loop with an aileron roll at the top. Lockheed built 3 of these Cosmic Winds back in 1947 and 1948, but they never saw much success in air races. 3 more aircraft were later built, but this particular one is an original. It was later shipped to the UK, where it finally saw air racing success at the King's Cup race in 1964. Today, it is the only flying Cosmic Wind in the world. Now, we saw a 4-point roll earlier from the Extra 300, but this really is something else, a 16-point roll, and I don't think I have ever seen that before.
Absolutely incredible.
Duxford's main airshow this September will mark the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, but that theme was part of the showcase day as well.
Leading the formation is Hurricane Mark 1 R4118, flown here by David Ratcliffe. This very aircraft was flown for 49 sorties in the Battle of Britain and was used to shoot down 5 enemy aircraft, thus becoming an ace in its own right, before it was withdrawn due to battle damage in October 1940. It wasn't returned to flight until 1941 and was used for several years as a training aircraft before being shipped to India, though it was never used there. Eventually, it was returned to the UK by Peter Vacker in 2001.
I'd just like to point out before we get comments that if you don't want us interrupting the sound of the Merlins, and I completely understand if you don't, then we do have an extended video of this display with no narration, and you can find that on our YouTube channel.
The remains of the Hurricane were cratered and shipped back to the UK for restoration.
As the Hurricane rounds off its sequence, in comes the Imperial War Museum's Spitfire Mark 1A N3200 for a sublime display of warbird aerobatics. This particular aircraft isn't a Battle of Britain veteran. In fact, it only flew one mission, and that was during Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk, when it claimed a single kill before being shot down itself. The wreckage was discovered in 1986 on a beach in Sangatte, and it was restored to flight in 2014. She's flown here in impeccable fashion by John Romain. And finally, it would be impossible to end this video without mentioning Sea Fury T20 WG655, which was badly damaged in a forced landing after the flying display. Nobody was hurt, but the aircraft may never fly again. Here she is in happier times, just a few hours earlier. And on that note, we bring to a close this episode of Airshow Dispatches. Next up will be at the Leszno Antidote Airshow in Poland, probably our only mainland European show of the year. But until then, stay safe, and from Alex Prinz and myself, Adam Landau, it's goodbye for now.